All right, all right. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for hanging out with us today. Excited to be sharing the stage here with Ali, with Paul, and with Andres. We're going to transition away from NFL. We're going to start talking about the business of some of the fastest growing sports leagues in the world. And Ali, I want to start with you. You are an investor, co-owner of the newest major U.S. professional team, Bay FC. And for folks who don't know, you just invested $53 million, the ownership group did, by far the biggest franchise fee ever paid in NWSL. Walk us through what you saw in women's sports, in NWSL specifically, that made you comfortable to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that we've known for a very long time, that women's sports, women's soccer in particular, have been undervalued properties in the marketplace. I think, us coming into the landscape this past year, we could have done it maybe 2-3 years before. The reality is, I think when you look at women's sports, women's soccer in particular, we know that 48% of girls play sports, but only get 4% of the media coverage. And we talk about the ability to drive narratives. We just haven't done that in the landscape as it relates to women's sports, women's soccer. And so the opportunity really presented itself in a very clear way, which was, if we start to invest in this space and we start to lean into this space and we tell those stories and we open up the market and we provide access to these players, to these incredible characters, that is going to shift the dynamics in the marketplace. Right now, 99.9% of all dollars in sports go to men's sports. And if we can just shift that by 5%, that is a massive, massive, meaningful number. And so we know it's undervalued. We know the data is going to catch up to our investment, quite frankly. And we still even think at $53 million that, it still has, we could have gone higher in this initial phase and still been in a really good spot to grow women's football.
Paul, you've told me a few times that you think of PLL as taking a thousands-year-old sport and creating a 21st century league around that. What does that mean exactly? What is a 21st century league in your eyes?
Well, I think there's two answers to that question. The first is that we're not building slam ball or rebranding cross-training to CrossFit. We're talking about a sport that in tech terms has product market fit. It's a game that had been around for over 1,000 years, created by the Native Americans of the Haudenosaunee, was the first team sport played at the college level in 1877, once an Olympic sport in 1904 and 1908. So you turn around, and I played my whole life. It's like, what happened? And I think if we are able to zoom out and see the growth of UFC, MLS, F1 in a modern media era with internet culture, with direct access to fans, we said, hey, why don't we sort of revive or rebuild, to your question, what pro lacrosse could be? And then came sort of the elements of which we were going to do that, which was take, I think, the best of individual sports and that they're tour-based, understand supply-demand, understand total audience size. When we started, there were 15 million lacrosse fans. Now, according to MRI Simmons, there are 45 million. Seeing our broadcast figures go up from a non-rating sport to getting 787,000 people watch on ABC in our opening weekend this summer. So a lot of things, and we could talk about the tactics that we're using to get there, but essentially we're all up here talking about the same thing, which is why in a modern economy, why with modern media can new sports emerge beyond the huge moat that protected the Big Four for hundreds of years.
Andres, I'm curious to get your perspective here. You've worked with NWSL athletes and teams. You've worked with Paul, I know, a number of times. From where you sit, what is this conversation? What are these leagues doing well that's breaking through?
So not that we consider these leagues, but some of these sports, at least in the jargon that we use internally, we call it growth or emerging sports, right? And they actually do very well because they provide us, some of the media outlets, with much more access and flexibility than the big leagues do, right? Working with NFL and the MLB, which we do, or the NBA, but they're very protective over their IP about the athletes. Now, when we look at the emerging women's soccer league, not only here, but in the UK or in Brazil, where we cover as well, or emerging sports like leagues like the PLL, once they give us access from the very beginning, we can help promote that. We can help to promote that locally in the communities. We can help tell the narratives of the athletes, and with that, promote these sports and help them grow, because we can't knock on their door once they're well established and huge, because of course they're going to protect their IP and they won't want us to work. So getting in there and being a partner at the very beginning, I think, is crucial for these leagues and for us as well.
Yeah, and I'll add to this two things. The first is, I think marketing in sports and marketing at large has gone from affinity, especially if you look at the early 1900s, the 50s, early 2000s, prior to new technology, has gone from affinity, paying a premium to be in a room, to specificity. And you can track results. You can do performance marketing. And CEOs, CROs want to see that from CMOs. And what we focus on is the ability to stand out with that specificity and performance marketing. The other thing that you mentioned was accessibility. And I admire NWSL and something that we do that at an earlier stage can create the rules that allow more access versus the traditional leagues that I think have hundreds and hundreds of Players Association handbooks to leagues and teams and access at IP from different levels. We give it to you all at one point.
And I think that's such a good point, or both of those are great points, and it relates really well to women's football in particular, because we had to create that access early on. Just take the NWSL out of it. From a U.S. soccer perspective, that was our professional league for a very long time. And so we had to have that relationship with our fan base. And that is exactly what you're talking about. You're talking about specificity to tell those stories to the marketplace where there's attraction, but also that access. And that's always been the narrative in women's football. And I think that's one of the reasons, even though NWSL is now going to its 12th year, you're still going to maintain, we're still going to maintain true to that pillar that built us to this point. And I think that players, as you start to get to that next level and you level up, always knowing where you came from is something that the PA has to understand, and something that we as a new team will absolutely be driving home to our players, our organization from day one.
A lot of this is democratization of media in some ways, right? That there's so many different ways, and Paul, you guys are on ESPN, but there's a lot of other things you're using, social media, streaming, et cetera, sites like the Players Tribune. It feels to me like a lot of the growth that you guys are seeing maybe would not have been possible. Correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe wouldn't have been possible if this was 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, you have to be everywhere, and you have to drill really deep down natively across each of the platforms or the editorials or the network. So that requires extensive resources. Whether you're building someone to enhance your TikTok platform or your presence, that has to be a native approach versus Meta or Twitter, or if you're putting out player voices and articles on Players Tribune. So I think understanding how new media has changed and what products live there are really important. I would say at the highest level, though, the biggest change in business that we've noticed over the last century is that you used to build a product, then you'd find product market fit by creating an audience to sell to that product. Now it's about building an audience and then creating a product for that audience. And that's sort of the creator economy that we're in now. And that's why Sport Beach, I think, is here now, from talking to a lot of the folks at Stagwell, is sport is the most authentic and organic place to interact with an existing audience. And then you go to places like the NWSL or the PLL to go even deeper for that specificity, to tell a story of a brand and how it integrates with that league, with those teams, and with their players.
So what outweighs which? There's more opportunity in media. There's also more competition, right? Paul, you mentioned slam ball. There was pickleball happening out here. There's so much more competition. I also feel like, is there does the opportunity outweigh the competition? I guess is the question.
Well, there's hundreds of billions of dollars in advertising, and there's the NBA, the NFL, Major League Baseball. So I think at a high level, we're all competing. And I think that's okay. I think what we need in sports is better communication from ownership to players. And I started as a player, and now I'm an owner. But then inside of that, you go down to what season you're in, right? And if you're a summer sport, trying to understand the brands that want to be in the summer. And then within the sports and the leagues in the summer, which demographics they sort of own. And then being able to tell that story to those brands or to those agencies and creating the best connection there. We think about pound for pound versus size. And the way that we spell that out is with engagement. So this year we're going to get 1.5 billion engagements across our league. That's 1 billion views. That's 200 million engagements. I've been walking up and down Rue and passing Hermes and Dior and Louis Vuitton. Every time I pass, that's an impression. When I walk in the store, that's an engagement. And that's me liking or comment. So it's on us as league operators to make sure that we're putting together production houses and resources to drive engagement, because that gets to the bottom of the funnel for brands where they actually see results.
I'm glad
that's how you differentiate, brother.
Very, very nice. I'm glad you mentioned players, right? Athletes, because one of the things I see as a thread between what the work all three of you do is I think you're all doing a really good job empowering athletes, understanding how valuable they are to storytelling, to your business. And I'm curious, and maybe Andres, maybe best for you to start here, how important that is and what you're seeing, the value that an athlete brings that maybe a league or a team, especially the more established ones, maybe doesn't do in terms of reaching specific people.
Yeah, look, at the Players Tribune, we're able to go a little bit deeper and humanize athletes, and I think those stories are very powerful. But to bring it back to the conversation right here, I think it's about community. And some of these athletes either want to connect deeper with a specific community, and I think PLL and BFC, it's all about community, right? And you're talking about building an audience, and I think you need to start from where you are and the people that really care, because you're talking about engagement. You know, we'll do an article with a big athlete, and obviously it'll get millions of reads and be everywhere. But if you look at the time on site of people actually going and reading it, sometimes it's even below of a not as well-known athlete, of not a huge sport, because that community is so highly engaged into that sport, into that athlete, and that community, that you'll see the time on page way surpass somebody in a big league. So I think it starts with a hyper-local approach, and building your audience there and having athletes connect with the community, even beyond the sport sometimes.
Ali, what are your conversations like with advertisers now? I assume you're preaching a lot of these things as you start to build the inaugural BFC partnership team.
Well, I think it starts with one of the questions even that you just referenced earlier, which is around the idea of the competition in the marketplace. There's more access, but there's more competition, right? And I think from a BFC perspective, our approach has always been, let's grow the pie together. And let's look at how we actually cross-platform strategize and bring, whether it's our partners together, whether we're bringing the league up to the next level, and how we're leveraging those assets. So I think we've looked at it like this is pie growing, and we've understood that for women's football in particular, there hasn't been this market, there hasn't been this access. So this opportunity to tell that story means that we actually have a lot of room to grow in the marketplace. As we tell that story with our partners, and as we look to strategize with sponsorships moving forward, obviously one of our key revenue drivers, the story starts local, as you said, and we understand that in the Bay Area, we have one of the richest communities. We have the most diverse communities, and the power of the Bay Area is not just Silicon Valley, it's not just San Francisco, it's not just Oakland. It's when we bring those communities together, and to be able to access that market for our partners is massive. We have one of the richest wealths of talent right there in the Bay Area, and I think for brands that is incredibly valuable. But then as we look to grow again in women's sports, it starts local, but it's global. This is the world's game, and there's an incredible opportunity for our partners, not just in the Bay Area, but as we start to see what the brand can do on a global level.
This may be a crazy question. How important are live games right now? For a century, it was everything, right? 100% of a league's revenue came from live games. Now it feels like the Drive to Survive has done a lot for F1 without drawing people to watching or going to races. I do wonder how, moving forward with this conversation we're having, how important you guys think the games actually are going to be in the business of your leagues moving forward.
It is the holy grail. You can't have Drive to Survive without the race. We can't tell our stories without the games. So to have a live game is not only critical to be able to tell other stories, whether it's shoulder, across social, across digital, with your app, gamify across fantasy, sports betting. The other thing, and why my feeling around why Sport Peach is so successful here, is that sport is the last standing firewall for attention, watching, consumption. And so the reason that is we pay a tax we're willing to pay a tax to consume our news and entertainment. That's a streaming service without ads. The market tends to be moving in that direction. And the conversation is, okay, all the cord cutters are happening. Sports are going behind a paywall, but not so fast. Sport have quarter breaks. They have timeouts. They have coaches timeouts. They have TV timeouts. They have in-game integration. There's no better product to advertise with your brands and with your clients than sport because of that. Layer on the element that athletes are sort of the most formidable celebrities today because they cross over into fashion and to music and to food and culinary and culture. So the live games, I actually think, much like history repeats itself, if we're smart enough, we figure out attention deficit and watch time decrease and figure out a way to produce the games differently such that someone who is growing up and watching YouTube because of all the jump cutting, perhaps that's what we need on ABC or on ESPN is jump cutting from camera to keep the attention on the live games.
That reminds me, was it Reed Hastings at Netflix who once said they're not competing with other media, they're competing against sleep? That is the thing that there's just so many options and so many availability that sleep is actually the competitor, not someone else.
Well, yeah, and a lot of times entertainment solves boredom, but I would say there was a clip out on what Ted Sarandos said about we want to be in the business of profitability when asked about sport, but that was a clip out. And the reason why is not that he doesn't think sports can be profitable, but they're looking at how to get into sports. And if you pay a massive rights fee of $2 billion to get a Thursday night NFL game, he doesn't see that as profitable as potentially what rumors have said Netflix is looking at M&A to get into it. They're building their advertising product. They are doing that because they know advertising is a part of sports for the same reasons that I just said. So streaming will be a place for sports into the future, especially the premium live games, but so will advertising within those games.
Ali, you played I don't believe you played in the NWSL, but you played in an earlier version of it. What do you think has changed? What's the difference between those teams that you played for and the team that you now co-own, which is obviously worth so much more money than things were a decade ago?
That's probably the headline. The investment is there to support these players, to bring the resources to these players, to be able to maximize their talent. But I also think one of the things you just hit on, Paul, was the idea that you need the game. Like, the game has to deliver. And I would be the first one to say that maybe in the leagues that I played in, the game didn't necessarily deliver. And you've got to have something that it grabs the attention, holds the attention. And yes, we do that through the storytelling as we weave it in and we get to those moments. But the game still has to deliver and deliver an entertaining product. And I think that's the massive difference. The players are so much better around the world. There's so much more depth of talent in the women's game. And it's not just the United States against the rest. The rest of the world is coming for the U.S., and they've got incredible, incredible players that now have opportunity to play in England in the WSL. They have an opportunity to play in Spain in their women's league. And so when we talk about opening up the market, it's not just here in the United States. It's from a global perspective, and that we have the talent to fill those squads in a meaningful way to deliver an entertaining product at the end of the day. That's the biggest difference besides the investment because, look, they were doing it for moral causes in the previous iterations of the league. Now they recognize it's a business opportunity, and it's time to deliver on that front.
Paul, last year, maybe 2 years ago, there was a great documentary that came out about the founding of the PLL. And there was a scene in there near the beginning that has stuck with me. And it was you and your brother, co-founder, Mike. You had gotten an offer, I think before you even played a single game, an offer from MLL, the established lacrosse league, to buy PLL. I think it was $35 million. Cameras are rolling as you and Mike kind of calculate how much that's going to be worth for each of you. It would obviously be getting your money out and then some. It's an offer that you guys obviously rejected. But take us back to that moment. I'm curious how you were thinking about the value of a league that hadn't played a single game yet relative to the $35 million offer.
Well, it was a complicated time. I was playing in the league that we were building, and I played in the now competitor. And what we had really looked at is opportunity for where professional lacrosse could be. And we were just at the precipice of that journey. What just was as difficult was raising our first round of capital. We had a safe note in market, and then we did a price round. And people were like, how do you value a sports league that hasn't played a game yet, that hasn't generated revenue yet? And so I think a lot of us were sort of, licking our fingers and turning the page and trying to make an assessment. But in the end, I think what you address, what you've addressed. Sport is about community. It's about equality. It's about accessibility. And for us, we had players that were getting paid $8,000 to play the season. And we had addressed that issue in 3 ways. We quadrupled their wages on average. We gave them stock options in the league, and we gave them health care. And that was before we played our first game. And so we wanted to build something that we believed would be better in 10 years from now. And so are we often challenged in life with short-term circumstances that may tap into a little primitive necessity? Yes. And those are the moments where we choose to either grow or stay stagnant. And we fortunately passed on that offer. We ended up buying MLL during the pandemic. And we've since increased our value of our business and what we pay our players and our viewership around it.
Do you still offer them stock options?
Yes. They get paid stock options for every game they played. And the first crop of players that got stock options were into their player agreement, their contract. So it's something that we talked quite a bit about with our board when we launched. And because we're a true single entity, we're a C Corp. And so we own the entire league, all 8 teams, and the marketing rights to our players. So it's much like an individual sports league. So we're able to turn on access differently than you get in traditional team sports. But as a result, much like at a startup, if you're an early stage employee and you get access to that employee cap table, which sits at 10% of the business or under, we decided to open that up not only to our employees, but our players, and they have the same class of shares that Mike and I have.
And I assume that makes them more invested in what you guys are doing, kind of more involved in the league relative to just being an employee of a team.
Well, we think so, and part of it was my experience, and I'll admit, I think I was probably a little overzealous with the previous ownership regime around what they should be doing. Now I'm on that side of the fence and know how hard it is. But if we look at NFL players of the 60s that didn't make nearly the wages that NFL players do today, and the NFL at large was the property of the television era, we look at our players and what they're being waged now versus what players will be in 20 years. We're the property of social media. We want to get that right. How can we help their compensation sort of learn from the past of what others didn't do?
Andres, you mentioned earlier that there are the engagement you see when on Players Tribune, when you get pieces from athletes or executives in smaller leagues. I'm curious if anything stands out to you, jumps out, a specific one that really popped on your site that was surprising to you.
Look, obviously, it has to do with timing because they're the Women's World Cup, right, coming up. We're seeing a very high engagement in women's soccer, especially in Brazil. But we don't want that to happen only because it's a Women's World Cup, right? So we want to make sure, and we even launched a campaign recently, that we want to cover and be committed to covering women's soccer throughout all the year. Because it's easy to do it right before the Women's World Cup. You get massive engagement, but what you have to do is commit to the sport, to the athletes, because it's about building trust and accessibility. And if you're only knocking at the door during the World Cup, so is everybody else. So, massive engagement right now with women's soccer. I think a lot with esports, even though esports is now mainstream now, but Formula One, women's tennis. So we're seeing sports that didn't maybe in the past perform as well, performing very well now. But also thank you to the streamers as well.
Ali, let's talk about the World Cup for a second. An experience that you had as a player, you have had professionally as a commentator. What is the Women's World Cup? And there are a number of NWSL players who will be playing over there. What does that mean for the professional league back home in the U.S.?
I mean, it's massive. I think we've done a lot of things wrong historically at the league level to capitalize on that momentum from a World Cup. And we've taken...
Like what?
Well, we've taken for granted that the U.S. is going to win, and we think we're gonna grab a hold of that momentum, and that's going to carry us through the next 4 years. And we don't necessarily have to think about how do we attract, retain, develop the top talent in the world. And I don't know that we can make that assumption anymore. This is going to be the most competitive World Cup next month that we've ever seen in the women's game. Yes, FIFA's expanded the field to include more teams, but I never before could sit up before you and say, I think there's 7 possible contenders that could bring home the trophy and say it with a straight face. That is the case this year, and that's the development we're talking about. When we talk with the players internationally, and you're talking about Brazil now interested in supporting their women's team, that's new. that's relatively new in the space. We talked about Europe for a long time. South America now is really leaning in and starting to understand the value of women's football. So I think when you look at the World Cup, how important it is for the leagues, whoever wins this World Cup, you're going to see a rocket ship take off for their domestic league at home if they have that set up. If they don't have one like Canada, my guess is they will quickly pull the trigger and get that moving. So whoever wins this World Cup, that is going to be an injection of capital. It's going to be an injection of interest. We talk about the dollars flowing into the sports space from a marketing perspective, from a sponsor perspective. That is absolutely going to happen, but it's also the eyeballs, opening the market, and people starting to care, having that affinity for the players, for their teams, and they're going to start to recognize, I loved Sophia Smith in the World Cup. Who does she play for? Portland Thorns. That's my team now, because we all know players, personalities, that's what drives fandom right now in the sports landscape. And so if we get that right, again, we're gonna be that top league moving forward. But if we don't, we're gonna have some work to do.
That's exactly right. So then Portland has to invest, NWSL has to invest in their athletes to capitalize on that momentum. There's not one professional sports league in history that has grown by waiting for the bottom up to continue to flourish. A lot of ownership groups historically have treated their professional teams or the league as if it's beachfront property in Cannes, right? And it's not. The NFL was not that. The NFL struggled like hell in the early 1900s. They were second to college. The NBA in the 80s until the David Stern turn and started investing in player marketing. That's what pro lacrosse used to look like, and that's what we wanted to change. That's what Allie's talking about with women's soccer. We're both unique. We're both in the summer. And there are a lot of brands who want to be unique. A lot of brands want to invest in women's sports. They're perfect for the NWSL. A lot of brands want to invest in young, sort of male-driven sports that have high spending power. They can be perfect for us. There's probably collaborations out there between the two of us that we've discussed in the past with different groups. And I think that's what makes sports so dynamic, right? I played multiple sports. My guess is that you did as well. And there's a reason for that.
We only have 2 minutes left, but I want to ask all three of you to look into your crystal ball for a second and tell me what we have not talked about on stage yet, but in 5 years at Cannes, around this exact topic, what you think we're going to be talking about.
Look, I think women's sports in 5 years. I think the acceleration and the growth that we've seen, and we can track it through media, like the performance of the stories we put out and the coverage compared to 5 years is incredible, and I think it's just gained momentum. And I think, like Ali said, before it was out of moral reasons. It's not anymore. It's because of performance and because of money. So I think it's here to stay, and the growth is going to be incredible.
I agree with that. My brain's running in different directions. I'm going to slow it down and just say one thing. In 5 years, we're going to have the LA 28 games. And so we have been on a process to get lacrosse back into the Olympics. We are an IOC officially recognized sport, and we finished our bid to get into LA 28. We're going to hear in August of this summer. So if that gets approved and we're one of the three, we're going to be talking about that quite a bit from the PLL microphones, but also across our partners at ESPN, Walt Disney Company.
Yeah, I think 5 years, I'll echo a bit of the sentiment. This is going to be about women's sports. And we're going to look back and say, do you remember that we were talking about there's only 4% of media dollars going into women's sports when 48% of the players in sports are women? I think that's going to be at a level playing field in 5 years. I think we're going to be talking about enterprise value in the NWSL that is going to be hitting the $200, $300, $500 million mark, rivaling MLS. I think if we get it right, this is the big question that I have for us internally, the NWSL and globally. If we get it right, we're going to look back and say, do you remember when we felt like WSL was catching up to us? And we're looking over our shoulder. And if we get it right, we're going to say, man, we pulled the right levers to stay on top as the top women's sports league or women's football league in the world. Or if we get it wrong, we missed our opportunity.
Well, I'm hoping you get it right. Ali, Paul, Andres, thank you very much for chatting with us.
Thanks to you.